start with, yesterday, I was telling a man in my close circle, I'm doing this panel. And his first question was, why do I need to know about this? Now, that was a very unfiltered response, but it's not an unfamiliar attitude. Those in the spectator seats often don't get the impact. Lesley, if I can begin with you, do you have tips for navigating these difficult conversations in the workplace and really conveying this impact to people that do not menstruate, that do not go through menopause?
Well, I have a reputation for being a bit of a blunt speaker, and I think it's great that you brought this panel up to your male colleague yesterday. And yes, it's not a surprising response, but I think you need to very gently go on to explain to him then that, you know, we're talking about things that happen to 51% of the population. So these are normal things. Most girls and women that you and I know, Ruth, are going to have 12 periods a year for 35 or 40 years of their life. So it's part of normal life. And because we all live so long now, I'm going to spend, I'm the first generation of woman who's menopausal woman who's going to spend longer in her menopausal state than she was reproductive. And that's never happened before. So I think it's really important that we get all of the society to understand what an important role women have to play, and how, if we understand what their day-to-day life needs are and healthcare needs are, we can really encourage them to make an even bigger contribution to the workforce and to society in general. So I think you started off the conversation, and now perhaps you could persuade him to watch some of this short recording, and hopefully we can all convince him that he really is going to do a lot. And I'm sure he's got women in his lives whom he cares about, mother, sister, partner, daughter, you know, all sorts of people who he will actually be able to help more if he understands what normal health requirements they have. And that's what's so simple about all this. And I know Caroline will agree with me, is that we can actually predict what girls and women are going to need. It's not rocket science. It's very, very straightforward. But we just have to talk about the things that affect their lives.
Absolutely, which makes the findings of the Menopause in the Workplace Survey, which was conducted by the Women and Equalities Committee, so interesting. I mean, to me, you know, the juxtaposition that 99% of the women surveyed said they experienced at least one menopause symptom. About a third of them needed to take time off. It affected them at the workplace. Yet most said their workplaces do not have any policies relating to it. Caroline, could you talk a little bit about what Minister's views are around this, and, you know, what could be done to make workplaces more equitable, really?
Well, it is about making sure that not only we address that massive gap in workplaces that have no policy at all, but that we look at those workplaces that have policies but have popped them neatly in a filing cabinet, never to be spoken of again. And I think it is so important that we break down the stigma and the taboo. We encourage people like your colleague to become allies, to have those open conversations with female colleagues, with their family members, with their friends, because it is 51% of women will go through the menopause at some time or other. And we also know that the biggest growing group of people in the workforce is menopausal women. So it's absolutely right that government is looking at this, that they're being encouraged to do so by my select committee, saying, look, what are we doing about whether we can make the menopause a protected characteristic? Do we need to? What are we doing about making sure that workplaces bring forward a decent policy that everybody is aware of? And we know there are some brilliant employers out there who are introducing just reasonable small adjustments the whole time to make the life of women in the workplace easier and simpler. But it's important that we encourage them, that we celebrate the good, and we also encourage them to make sure that there is a culture of openness and understanding amongst men as well as women. So we can't focus the conversation just on women. We have to bring men along with us as well, so that they feel confident to be able to talk to their employees or their employers, to be able to talk to colleagues and have those sorts of discussions that just say, hey, I can see that you're finding X difficult, whether it's the temperature in the office or whether it's the uniform or the hours of work. And say, how can we make your life easier? How can we be more adaptable? And if over the course of the last couple of years we have learned anything, it must be that we can be more adaptable and flexible in the way that we work.
One of the things in terms of making these adjustments and taking people along was, flexible working came up a lot in the survey. And about 43% of women said that they requested it. As companies slowly start rolling back the flexible work benefits related to the pandemic, how do you see this really impacting women in the workplace? And, what can be done to make it better? Should there be public sector incentives or guidelines? Lesley, what are your views on that?
Well, I think it's really important to incentivize people. I'm a great believer in that carrots give you a lot more progress rather than sticks. So let's have aspirations for companies to really be great employers. And one of the things that I've been doing with Wellbeing of Women, the charity that I chair, is developing a menopause workplace pledge. And we've deliberately made the bar very attainable. This isn't an onerous commitment. And I think Bloomberg should sign up, because I don't think you've signed up yet. But I do think it's really important. It's about making sure that the employees, both men and women in your workplace, are understanding, they understand the language, feel free to talk about it, signposting women to really good information, and allowing them to talk about these things and share with what they may need. And I think there's an economic argument which is completely unstoppable about this. Why would you, if you're employing women in their late 40s, 50s, and possibly 60s now, why would you let go your most experienced and your most productive part of the workforce just because nobody can talk to them about the fact that they're having appalling sleep, and they've got hot flushes, or they just need to work in a different environment, or they need to be able to change their clothes or whatever. And everything that applies to menopause can also apply to menstrual periods as well, because, as I said, they're very, very common. And I think it's just a no-brainer, isn't it? If we want society to become more productive and more equitable, then we've got to actually ensure that half of the population are catered for as well. And it's not difficult. And the vast majority of men that I speak to about it, and employers of large number of women, their usual response is, well, I didn't realise. And of course it makes sense. What can I do? So I think that they are very willing to join the cause.
And I'm curious, Caroline, including in government, have you had experience around what works in terms of creating awareness about menstruation and menopause in the workplace? What strategies work the best? And is there any country that's doing it really well? And I say this knowing that globally, the UK is actually ahead of the curve on a lot of this.
And I think that's a really valid point, is that we now have a raft of ministers who are talking about this very openly and constructively. I'm still pushing to see ministers bring forward an employment bill that contains flexible working as a day one right. I think that's crucially important. But it's about good HR practices. It's about making sure that companies are recognising, as Lesley said, the productivity benefits of keeping your experienced senior women in the workforce. And there are many reasons why you want to do that. It's not just that they're more productive, but they also provide an inspiration and a role model for younger women coming into work. And we know that there are all sorts of challenges that will beset women during their working lives. We saw during the pandemic that it was women that carried the largest share of childcare and indeed caring responsibilities for older family members. We know that it is women who are most likely to take a longer career break for child raising. And we also know that later on in their careers, they might be negatively impacted by the menopause and might need to take a break at that time. So look, this has a massive impact on a woman's earning capacity. We know from research undertaken by Standard Chartered that 50% of women have turned down an additional responsibility at work because of the menopause, and that 25% have considered leaving work altogether. So that impacts their income very, very significantly. It also impacts their pension contributions. So this can be something that will impact a woman for the rest of her life. And I think it's therefore absolutely imperative that the government finds mechanisms through legislation to protect women better in the workforce, to encourage companies to do the right thing, to be supportive, to make sure that provision is there for small adjustments. And in the majority of cases, the adjustments are small. And is generally very supportive. Now, look, I think that the British government is not doing a bad job on this, but I want to see them be a real world beater and really lead the way. And I think in the UK, we've done a fantastic job about breaking down the stigma. And there's a massive amount of credit has to go to organisations like the Wellbeing of Women, like people like Davina McCall, who've been such a champion, but say, look, this is society pushing for change. It's time for government to really get involved and bring forward some legislative benefits.
Yes, and speaking about productivity, last year we wrote extensively about menopause in the workplace, and a Frost and Sullivan estimate said that productivity losses related to it globally could cost more than 150 billion a year. UK data during the pandemic shows the highest number of people in the 50 to 70 age demographic are quitting workplaces. And the question then is, to what extent government policies can change this, or what companies should be doing to retain this workforce because of the impact, as you rightly pointed out, on the pensions, and you're going from women earning 75 cents to the dollar on an average globally to that gap increasing much more in pensions. I mean, Lesley, do you have any ideas on what it would look like if they were trying to retain people in this age group and the benefits that they would employ? And, does it mean also speaking to healthcare practitioners and getting them in to tell managers, this is what you need to change?
I think we need to broaden this way beyond health, because there's always a temptation, I think, in this world for if there's a problem such as the menopause or problem period, that we think, oh, right, well, the healthcare sector is going to sort that out. And that's where I think the UK's become a bit complacent, because, we've got this religion called the National Health Service, which, of course, I totally support, and I've worked in it for 42 years. But the thing is that we know that the medicine that I was trained to deliver is only a third of the solution, and that the other 2/3 of the solution are all the social determinants of disease, the situations in which you were born and you live, and whether you were educated to a good standard. It affects every part of your lives, particularly women's lives, because women who don't complete their secondary education will never be as healthy as people who do complete it. So wealth can buy you out of bad health only to a certain extent, and you need really good educational platforms as well to really get the very best health. So what I'm saying in a rather roundabout way is that I don't think it should be Department of Health or whatever it is, your equivalent is, in the US. I think this is really important that we have the Department for Work and Pensions, and that we have the Home Office, because we've got to all deal with violence. It's a prevalence, across every country in the world, the same prevalence, and it goes through every strata of society. It has no special people there. We've got to we've got to make sure that the education sector really understands the role that they've got to play. I just can't think of a department in the UK government that I don't think's got a role to play in this.
And Lesley is so right about that, is that the role for education is enormous. We focus so much time and energy on teaching young women how not to get pregnant that in too many instances we forget completely that there will come a time in their lives when they can no longer get pregnant, but we don't bother to explain that to them at school. And I think it's so important that we work harder about making this not just about health. It's about every aspect of women's lives. And there's a massive role for, as Lesley said, the Department for Work and Pensions, but also the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice. This really does require everybody to be involved.
Actually, one interesting thing we found was that companies with female CEOs, and we're looking at the UK, but I'm sure maybe we see this in some other markets as well, were at the forefront of putting policies in place around menopause, Severin Trent, GlaxoSmithKline, to name a few. But only 10% of FTSE 100 companies have female CEOs. So then the question arises, to what extent does gender diversity at the top influence better policies around issues that affect only women? And is this kind of a twofer thing where if you don't get gender diversity at the top of companies, you're going to affect all of the policies for women?
I think go on.
Sorry, Lesley, you go.
The importance about gender diversity is that's the only way that you can achieve sustainable change. You can achieve a bit of change if you have policies. And that's where I think Caroline's push to get government legislation is so crucial, because we do need to have those to be the framework for, to be able to wrap around. But the bottom line is, you mentioned the FTSE 100. What I think is interesting is that the FTSE 100, as opposed to the FTSE 250, has got a much higher proportion of female board members. So there's a very tangible piece of evidence that if you have senior females in positions of influence and power, then you go from the FTSE 250 to the FTSE 100, unequivocal. And there is so many examples in the education and university sector that show exactly those sorts of trends. And, we just need to look around, don't we, who their female leaders were and politicians were and their responses to the COVID pandemic. I mean, I don't want to jump on a bandwagon, but, they were more compassionate, more practical, more common sense approaches, which led those countries to a less traumatic outcome. So I just think we're wasting a trick if we don't use the resources we've got in the women in our society, because I firmly believe that when you get it right for women, everybody benefits.
And Caroline, you are one of the few leaders that is doing inspirational things to change the status quo. But, you wanted to say something to the point that I was raising.
Yeah, so, I mean, we know, don't we, that when you have a more diverse group of people making decisions, you get better decisions. And Lesley uses the example of the pandemic. She's right to do so. And I spent a lot of time looking at the gendered impact of COVID and getting really very angry that we had a recovery from COVID that I felt had been designed by men for men. And that was because there were too few women sat around the top table making those decisions. But it's imperative that we don't just look at the prism of who's the CEO of a FTSE 100. We look at their pipelines. We look generally how many women are sitting on boards. We look more widely at the gender pay gap and keep pushing to make sure that we see the pay gap diminish, to make sure that we see an increasing number of women in senior positions, in leading companies and indeed leading organizations. I always celebrate when you see great inspirational women leading things like the Royal College of Nursing, but there is still a long way to go. And I get very cross when I hear complacency that women have achieved equality. No, we're still a long way from it, and there's a great deal more work to be done.
I mean, the UK is ahead of the curve when it comes to pregnancy leave for women, for instance. And I say this having been in the US and seen how that market plays out. Do you think we could come to a time when there's menopause and menstruation-linked time off that people can take in companies? I mean, I know there are some companies that do that individually, but could the UK look like that?
I think the UK could look like that. I think we need work around time off for the menopause. I think that's really important, that there should be sufficient flexibility and adaptability for different companies. But it's incumbent upon people like me and Lesley to use our voices to keep pushing for that.
Lesley, any final thoughts?
I completely agree. And if we could clone Caroline Nokes and have a lot more politicians in Westminster, I'd be a much happier woman. I really would be, because she's just what someone who, like myself, who's passionate about women's health. I need her on my side. She's a tour de force, and long may she continue in that shaking the cage as chair of that Women's Equality Committee.
Here's to more women in leadership.
Absolutely.
Thank you both.